Right. So picture this, imagine your body is like this massive fortress, right? I mean, not just like walls and a moat and stuff, but, a whole network inside constantly dealing with, intruders and threats.
Hmm.
And today we're diving deep into, like the intelligence network within those walls.
Okay.
The scouts, the ones who,
Yeah.
spot the trouble and then, relay that intel to the defense command. We're talking about antigen presenting cells, or APCs.
Yes.
You sent over a super interesting university lecture, breaking down these crucial cells.
Yeah, that was a good one.
It was really good.
It gets into a lot of the, the nitty-gritty details of how these cells work.
So for this deep dive, right,
Mhm.
our mission is to kind of extract, the need to know stuff from that lecture. How do these APCs actually function? Why are they so important for our immune system?
Right.
What are like the key takeaways?
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating about this whole topic is that this process of like identifying these threats and responding to them is happening right now, like literally all the time, constantly, without us even knowing. It's like this, incredibly sophisticated security system that's always running in the background.
I like that analogy a lot.
Yeah.
So, okay, let's get into it. What are antigen presenting cells?
So basically, APCs are these specialized cells that are just absolutely critical for the adaptive immune response.
All right.
And you can think of the adaptive response as like, your body's highly trained and, elite force
Okay.
that's very specific. They're trained for specific missions.
Yeah.
And the APCs, their job is to kind of capture,
Right.
process, and then show fragments of the invaders, right? And we call those fragments antigens to the T cells,
Right.
which are like, the commanders of the immune response.
Okay, so the APCs are like the intelligence gatherers. They go out, they find pieces of the enemy, bring it back to the T cell generals
Yeah.
so they can figure out, the best strategy for attack.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
Like a reconnaissance mission,
Yeah, exactly.
bringing back intel.
Now, the lecture you sent over mentioned a few main types of APCs. Can we kind of go through those and their specific roles?
Yeah. So there are three main players that we talked about.
Okay.
Dendritic cells,
Okay.
macrophages,
Right.
and B cells.
Okay.
And each one kind of has its own specialization.
Gotcha.
So dendritic cells, these are considered like the most potent APCs.
Okay.
And what's really interesting about them is where they're located. They're found in tissues that are exposed to the outside world.
Okay.
Like, your skin
Yeah.
and the linings of your nose and your mouth.
Yeah.
So they're strategically placed to be like the first responders
Right, at the entry points.
of the immune system, constantly sampling their environment for anything suspicious.
Always on patrol.
Exactly. Always on patrol.
I like that.
So that's dendritic cells.
Okay, dendritic cells, first responders.
First responders.
What about macrophages? We hear about those a lot.
macrophages? Those are all over the place.
Okay.
They're found throughout your body's tissues. And they kind of have this like dual function.
Okay.
So on one hand, they're like the cleanup crew,
Yeah.
right? They clear away cellular debris. They, get rid of pathogens that are just kind of floating around.
So they're like the sanitation workers of the body.
But they also serve as antigen presenters, especially during like an active infection.
Okay.
So they'll engulf invaders. They'll eat them up, and then they'll present pieces of those invaders to the T cells.
So they're taking out the trash, but they're also reporting back, to headquarters about what they found.
Exactly. They're multitasking.
I like it.
Yeah, they're very efficient.
Okay, so we've got dendritic cells, the first responders. We've got the macrophages, doing sanitation and also reporting.
Intelligence.
Exactly. And then we have B cells. And we know these guys, their primary role is producing antibodies.
Right.
Those like targeted weapons of the immune system.
The guided missiles.
Right. But they also do antigen presentation, right?
They do, yeah. So while, antibody production is like their main gig.
They can also present antigens to specifically T helper cells, the CD4 plus T cells.
Okay.
And what's interesting here is this interaction actually helps the B cells become fully activated
Oh, wow.
to produce those antibodies.
It's like a feedback loop.
It is, yeah. It's a clever mechanism to get the whole adaptive immune system, fired up and ready to go.
That is clever. I like that a lot. Okay, so we've got these different types of APCs all contributing in their own way.
Right.
Now, how do they actually accomplish this core task of, capturing, processing, and presenting these antigens?
Right.
The lecture went into some pretty good detail here.
Yeah, so there's a couple of key steps that we need to understand.
Okay.
So first is antigen capture.
Okay.
APCs encounter pathogens at the site of infection.
Right.
And they have a couple of ways to grab onto them.
Okay.
So dendritic cells and macrophages, They can actually physically engulf the entire pathogen.
Right.
That process is called phagocytosis.
Yes.
You can think of it like Pac-Man,
Yeah, Pac-Man, eating the little dots. Yeah, the cell just gobbles up the invader.
Gobbles it right up.
And then they can also take in specific pathogen proteins through what's called receptor-mediated endocytosis.
Okay.
So imagine like the cell has these specific docking bays, on its surface that only certain enemy ships can latch onto.
Okay.
And then once inside, these captured antigens are broken down into smaller peptide fragments within the cell.
Right.
And that's the processing stage.
So it's like capturing an enemy soldier and then, breaking down their uniform and equipment to get like smaller, more digestible pieces of information.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
That's exactly what's happening.
Okay.
So then comes antigen presentation.
Right.
So these peptide fragments, now they need to be displayed on the surface of the APC so that the T cells can actually recognize them.
Right.
And this is where these MHC molecules come in major histocompatibility complex molecules.
Okay, yeah, we've encountered MHC before.
Yeah, so these are like the billboards of the immune system. So the peptide fragments, they're loaded onto these MHC molecules.
Okay.
And then the whole complex is transported to the cell surface. So it's like, putting a wanted poster up on a billboard for all the T cells to see.
Okay, so the APC grabs the bad guy, chops him up, puts the pieces on an MHC billboard, and then drives around town hoping a T cell spots it.
Exactly.
I like it.
Okay, that's a good way to think about it.
And then that recognition by the T cells is the next step, T cell activation.
Right. So T cells have these specific receptors called TCRs. And you can think of these receptors as like highly specific locks that are designed to fit the key, presented by the MHC antigen complex. So when a T cell's receptor binds to that specific peptide that's being presented on the MHC molecule, it triggers that T cell to become active.
Okay.
And this is the moment when the adaptive immune response really gets going.
So if the APCs didn't do their job of presenting the antigen, the T cells would basically be blind to the threat.
Yeah, they'd have no idea what to target.
Right.
So the APCs are absolutely essential for initiating that focused response.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, the lecture you sent over goes into, greater depth about this thing called MHC class 2 molecules.
Right.
And it seems like these are particularly important, for the APCs that we've been talking about.
MHC class 2. Yeah, let's get into it. The lecture described the structure, these alpha and beta chains forming a peptide binding groove. What's so special about this two-chain structure?
Yeah, so the two-chain structure is what makes MHC class 2 so versatile.
Okay.
This heterodimer, it's composed of two different protein chains, right?
Okay.
Kind of like two halves of a specialized tool.
Gotcha.
And together they create this groove, this peptide binding groove, and that groove is where the processed antigen fragment actually sits.
Okay.
And the specific amino acid sequence within this groove, it can vary. And this allows it to bind to like a huge variety of different peptide fragments.
Oh, wow.
So it's really adaptable.
That makes sense.
And that's super important because it allows your immune system to recognize just a vast array of potential invaders.
Right, right. That's huge because you can't possibly predict, what you're going to encounter out in the world.
Exactly. You need that flexibility.
You need to be ready for anything.
Right.
And this structure allows for that.
Yeah, exactly.
And the lecture mentioned that MHC class 2, it's mainly found on those professional APCs. The dendritic cells, macrophages, and B cells.
Right.
And not typically on all body cells, unlike MHC class. So why is that distinction important?
So that's a really crucial point. MHC class 2 molecules are designed to present what we call exogenous antigens.
Okay.
And those are antigens that originate from outside of the cell.
Okay.
So like bacteria viruses that have been engulfed by the APC.
Gotcha.
And since MHC class 2 is primarily on those professional APCs, the ones that are specialized for engulfing these external threats, it makes sense that they be the ones presenting those antigens.
Right. It's like their specialized job.
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, MHC class I, on the other hand,
right,
that presents what we call endogenous antigens.
Okay.
So these are antigens that are coming from inside the cell.
Okay.
Like, viral proteins that are being produced within an infected cell.
Gotcha.
And these are displayed on pretty much all nucleated cells in the body.
Okay.
And that's a signal to another type of T cell, these cytotoxic T cells.
Right.
Basically saying, hey, this cell is compromised, you need to eliminate it.
Interesting, okay.
But our focus today, like the lecture emphasized, is really on MHC class 2 and how it helps to activate these CD4 plus T helper cells.
Right. So MHC class 2 is specifically for those external threats, those exogenous antigens. And it's specifically communicating with the CD4 plus T helper cells.
Exactly.
Okay, now how does this presentation through MHC class II actually lead to the activation of these T cells?
Right. So the CD4 plus T cell receptor on the T cell,
Okay.
it recognizes that specific peptide fragment that's
Boy.
nestled within the MHC class II molecule on the APC surface.
Okay.
But that recognition alone isn't always enough for full activation. The APC also needs to provide what we call co-stimulatory signals.
Okay.
So think of these as like a second confirmation.
Let's double check.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So there are these molecules like CD80 and CD86 on the APC,
Okay.
and they bind to corresponding receptors on the T cell.
Okay.
So the MHC peptide complex, that's like the initial handshake,
Right.
And then these co-stimulatory molecules, they're like the second handshake that really seals the deal.
It's like two-factor authentication.
Exactly.
To make sure you don't accidentally set off the alarm.
Right. You don't want any false alarms.
Exactly. And once these CD4 plus T cells are activated, what happens?
So they become like the orchestrators of the adaptive immune response.
Wow.
They start releasing these signaling molecules called cytokines.
Right.
And you can think of cytokines as like molecular messengers with very specific instructions.
Gotcha.
So, for example, they can stimulate B cells to start producing antibodies. Or they can activate macrophages to become even better at engulfing and destroying pathogens.
So they're like the conductors, leading the rest of the immune orchestra.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
And that's all starting, with that initial signal from the APCs.
Right.
Okay, so we're getting a really good picture of this whole process.
Right.
Now, APCs capture process antigens, present them on MHC class II to the CD4 plus T cells.
Right.
And then at that second signal, those T cells become the conductors leading the rest of the immune orchestra.
Exactly.
Now, the lecture also went into some detail about how APCs interact with these other immune cells specifically.
Right.
T cells, B cells, and macrophages.
Yeah.
So let's explore those interactions a little bit more.
Okay.
So we already touched on, the APC T cell interaction, but what were some of the key insights there?
So the key takeaway there is that MHC class II presentation, it's absolutely fundamental for the immune system to recognize a specific pathogen.
Right.
And for initiating that whole adaptive immune response. And again, the lecture emphasized the importance of those co-stimulatory molecules,
Right.
CD80 and CD86, for full T cell activation.
Okay.
Without that second signal, the T cell might not become fully active, or in some cases, it could actually become tolerant to the antigen.
Tolerant. That's interesting, the idea of the immune system,
Yeah.
not reacting to something.
Yeah, and that's super important for preventing autoimmunity.
Right, so it doesn't attack itself.
Exactly.
Okay, we'll have to keep that in mind. What about the interaction between APCs and B cells?
So B cells, as we discussed earlier, they can actually act as APCs themselves.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they can bind to specific antigens using their B cell receptors.
Right.
And they can internalize those antigens, process them into those peptide fragments,
Okay.
and then present them on MHC class II molecules to the CD4 plus T cells.
Gotcha.
And when an activated T helper cell recognizes that presented antigen on the B cell, and it gets those co-stimulatory signals,
Right.
it then provides help to that B cell.
Okay.
And this help, it often comes in the form of these cytokines, those molecular messengers.
Yeah.
And those cytokines are really important for the B cell to mature into an antibody-producing plasma cell.
Right.
And also to refine the antibodies that it produces so that they're even better at targeting that specific pathogen.
So it's almost like the B cell is saying, hey, T helper cell, I think I found our target. And then it shows the T helper cell the evidence.
Yeah.
And then the T helper cell is like, okay, yeah, you got it. I'm going to help you build the right weapons to fight this thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
It's like a tag team effort.
Awesome. And then finally, we have the interaction between APCs, particularly macrophages, and other immune cells. So we know macrophages are APCs presenting antigens to T cells, but they also respond to activated T cells, right?
They do, yeah. So activated T helper cells, they release these cytokines. And one important example is TNF alpha.
Okay.
And those cytokines can act on the macrophages, and they actually enhance the macrophage's ability to engulf and destroy pathogens.
So it's this reciprocal relationship. It's like a feedback loop.
Right, so they're helping each other out.
Exactly.
Okay.
Macrophages present antigens to activate T cells.
Right.
And then those activated T cells send signals back to the macrophages to make them even more effective at their job.
So it's like constant communication.
It is, yeah. It's this beautiful back and forth communication between the different players in the immune system.
And it's all starting, with that initial antigen presentation by the ATC.
Right, exactly.
So it's a very elegant and coordinated system.
It is. It's really remarkable.
So this brings us to, kind of a crucial question. Why are these APCs so important for our immune response overall?
Right.
The lecture touched on a few key reasons.
Yeah, so there are a few really critical roles that the APCs play.
Okay.
So first and foremost, they initiate the adaptive immunity.
Right.
So they're the bridge between that initial, more general innate immune response and the highly specific adaptive response. So they take the information about the invading pathogen from the front lines, they bring it to the T cells, and they essentially tell the adaptive immune system what to target.
Right.
Without this information transfer, the adaptive response would be totally lost.
It'd be like shooting in the dark.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're the intelligence agency providing that intel to the specialized forces.
Right.
What was the second reason?
So the second really important role is in maintaining tolerance to self-antigens. So APCs are constantly sampling the body's own proteins.
Right.
And if they present these self-antigens to T cells without those danger signals.
Right, those co-stimulatory molecules.
Exactly.
It's a second handshake.
Right. Without that second handshake, it can lead to the T cells becoming tolerant.
Okay.
Meaning they won't attack the body's own tissues.
Right.
And this is like a really delicate balance.
Yeah.
But it's crucial because if it goes wrong, it can result in autoimmune diseases.
Right, where the immune system attacks itself.
Exactly, where the immune system mistakenly targets the body's own cells.
That makes sense. So it's like the APCs are teaching the immune system.
Yeah.
No, this is us don't attack this.
Right, it's like immune education.
Yeah. Don't shoot your friends.
Exactly.
Only shoot the enemies.
Right.
Okay, and what was the third reason?
So the third really important role is in the development of immune memory.
Okay.
So the interaction between APCs and T cells during an initial infection,
Right.
that's actually crucial for generating what we call memory T cells. And these memory cells are really long-lived.
Oh, right.
And they provide a much faster and much stronger immune response if you encounter that same pathogen again in the future.
Oh, wow.
And this is the basis for long-lasting immunity, whether it's acquired through natural infection or through vaccination.
So they're not just involved in that initial fight, they're also setting up our defenses for the long term.
Exactly. Yeah, they're thinking ahead.
I like it. Okay, so let's quickly just summarize the key takeaways from this deep dive into the lecture, just to kind of solidify everything we've talked about.
Yeah, so I think the main points are that first, antigen presenting cells, these are essential for initiating that adaptive immune response.
Right.
By capturing, processing, and presenting antigens to the T cells.
Right. Those are the 3 steps.
Exactly.
Capture, process, present.
Yeah, and then second, MHC class II molecules.
Right.
Those are really important for presenting those external threats to the CD4 plus T helper cells.
Okay.
Which then orchestrate the broader adaptive immune response.
Right.
And then third, APCs, they don't work in isolation. They work in close coordination with, T cells, B cells, macrophages.
Whole team.
Yeah, the whole immune team.
Right.
To mount a really effective immune response and to establish that long-lasting immune memory.
Right.
And then finally, that balance between activating the immune system to fight threats and maintaining tolerance to the body's own tissues, that's absolutely crucial for overall health.
Right. Don't want to be attacking yourself.
Exactly.
Okay.
And APCs play a key role in maintaining that delicate balance.
That is fascinating stuff. This has been a really cool exploration into the world of APCs. They really are like the unsung heroes.
Yeah, they are.
Of the immune system.
Yeah.
Constantly on patrol.
Right.
Providing that vital intel, that dictates how our body defends itself.
Absolutely. And they're constantly making decisions, about what to respond to and what to ignore. And that brings up, I think, a really interesting question for you to consider. Given how critical APCs are in this fundamental ability to distinguish between self and non-self,
right.
What implications does that have for understanding those conditions where that distinction breaks down?
Right.
Like in autoimmune diseases or even in organ transplant rejection?
That is a really good question, and that really highlights, just how intricate and complex our immune system is.
Yeah, it's mind-boggling.
It is.
When you really start digging into it.
It is. It's incredible.
Yeah.
So if this deep dive has, sparked your curiosity, and I really hope it has, just remember, this has been a foundational overview.
Yeah. We just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to learn about these cells.
Absolutely.
You know, those detailed signaling pathways,
Right.
the specific characteristics of the different APC subtypes, the cutting-edge research into how we can, manipulate these cells for therapeutic purposes.
Yeah, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening in that area.
Like vaccines and even cancer treatments.
Exactly.
So you know what aspects of this whole APC function or their interactions with other immune cells, what piques your interest the most?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a whole world of immunology out there just waiting to be explored.
That's the truth.
It's truly fascinating.
It is. It's amazing.
So keep learning, keep exploring, and we'll catch you in the next deep dive.
Sounds